Dahomey Royal Corps. In 1892, during the Second Franco-Dahomeyan War in West Africa, French colonial troops advanced toward the capital of Abomey, expecting to confront a conventional royal army. Instead, as the morning mist lifted from the palm-lined plains, they saw disciplined ranks of uniformed women emerging in formation. They marched in columns 4 across, rifles resting against their shoulders, blades strapped at their waists. Officers later recorded that these soldiers did not hesitate under artillery fire. They advanced in synchronized waves, stepping over the fallen without breaking alignment. What the French encountered was not a symbolic guard. It was a standing female army trained for war. The Kingdom of Dahomey, located in present-day Benin, had maintained this corps for over 2 centuries. Known locally as the Mino, meaning our mothers, the unit was embedded at the core of state power. Recruits were selected through a structured process. Some were volunteers seeking advancement, others were assigned by royal decree. Once enlisted, they lived inside fortified barracks near the palace complex. They were forbidden from marriage and were sworn directly to the king. Their identity was military before anything else. French intelligence reports described a hierarchical structure within the corps. There were commanders, sub-commanders, and specialized divisions. Some units focused on marksmanship with flintlock muskets that weighed nearly 10 pounds and required disciplined coordination to reload under pressure. Others trained with machetes designed for close-quarters combat. European observers documented obstacle drills in which recruits scaled walls embedded with acacia thorns to prove endurance. Live fire exercises were conducted regularly. This was not ritual display. It was sustained conditioning. Captured weapons in battlefield remains confirm operational deployment. Muskets recovered from Dahomey sites showed signs of repeated discharge. Uniform remnants revealed standardized equipment distribution. French casualty lists noted that many of the most aggressive assault waves consisted entirely of female soldiers who attempted to close the distance despite heavy gunfire. One officer wrote that their cohesion under pressure rivaled trained European infantry. Mainstream interpretation has often reduced the Dahomey Corps to an exotic anomaly, a curiosity amplified by colonial fascination. Yet, numerical estimates suggest that, at peak strength, the Corps may have numbered between 2,000 and 6,000 women, representing a substantial percentage of Dahomey's total fighting force. In a kingdom engaged in frequent regional warfare, maintaining such a force required logistics, supply chains, command systems, and continuous recruitment. It required institutional design. When French forces ultimately overpowered Dahomey through superior artillery and repeating rifles, the corps did not dissolve in panic. Reports describe final charges carried out in tight formation. Survivors were disbanded only after the kingdom's collapse. Colonial authorities formally dissolved the unit, integrating remaining members into civilian roles and reframing their existence as relics of a bygone order. But battlefield records remain. European officers acknowledged that among all adversaries in the region, the Dahomey women were the most formidable. If a centralized African state sustained a professional female military corps for generations, complete with rank, barracks, training regimens, and strategic deployment, then the idea that organized female armies were rare exceptions begins to weaken. If such a system existed openly until confronted by modern empire, how many similar structures were dismantled before they could be fully documented? Scythian warrior society. In 1993, near the Black Sea steppes of southern Russia, archaeologists excavating a burial mound uncovered what initially appeared to be the grave of a mounted nobleman. The skeleton lay beside a 3-foot composite bow, a quiver packed with bronze-tipped arrows, an iron sword roughly 30 inches in length, and the remains of a horse harness placed carefully near the skull. But osteological analysis overturned the assumption. The warrior was biologically female. The left humerus showed pronounced muscle attachment consistent with years of archery. A puncture wound between 2 ribs had healed before death. This was not a ceremonial burial. It was the grave of a trained fighter. The Scythians, dominant across the Eurasian steppe from roughly the 9th to the 1st century BCE, operated within a society where mobility defined survival. Entire communities traveled on horseback, migrating across vast grasslands that stretched thousands of miles. Their warfare relied on mounted archery, speed, and coordinated hit-and-run tactics. In such an environment, Every capable rider strengthened the collective defense. Excavations across regions spanning modern Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia have revealed that a significant percentage of warrior graves belonged to women. In some sites, nearly one-third of individuals buried with weapons were female. These burials were not segregated or marked differently. The weapons were full-scale military tools, not miniature symbolic items. Arrowheads found embedded in vertebrae and pelvis bones confirm combat exposure. The draw weight of recovered bows often exceeded 80 pounds, requiring sustained conditioning. Mainstream interpretation once treated Greek accounts of Amazon warriors as mythological exaggeration. Herodotus described mounted women who fought alongside men and refused marriage until proving themselves in battle. For centuries, scholars dismissed these passages as fantasy, but the burial evidence complicates that dismissal. The skeletal remains show riding-induced hip development, arm stress consistent with archery, and healed fractures typical of battlefield trauma. The Scythian case differs from centralized kingdoms like Dahomey or Kush. Here, the military system was not a separate institution layered upon society. It was integrated into daily life. Young girls appear to have been trained in riding and archery alongside boys. Mobility was survival. Defense required collective readiness. There is little evidence of rigid separation between civilian and soldier. Weapon standardization across graves indicates shared equipment design. Arrowheads follow consistent patterns. Sword lengths fall within similar ranges. This suggests organized production and distribution networks within tribal confederations. Female warriors were not anomalies scattered randomly. They were part of the same military ecosystem as male riders. What challenges later narratives is the normalization of this structure. If a society integrated women into mounted combat roles as routine practice, then the concept of gender-exclusive armies may be a later development rather than an ancient universal rule. When more centralized patriarchal empires emerged, they may have interpreted such integration as inversion or aberration. As Scythian territories were absorbed or displaced by expanding powers, their social structure faded from dominant memory. Greek myth preserved echoes in the form of Amazons, but myth strips systems of their administrative logic. What remains in legend becomes spectacle, not policy. If the Scythians operated as a mobile military society where women formed a measurable portion of armed riders, then one of the earliest large-scale cavalry systems in Eurasia was not exclusively male. If myth preserved their existence while history categorized them as fantasy, how many integrated military systems were later reclassified as legend once empire rewrote the record? Sarmatian cavalry regiments. In the 2nd century CE, along the Danube frontier, Roman scouts reported an approaching cavalry force moving in disciplined formation across the open plains. The riders wore scale armor that shimmered under the sun, iron plates overlapping like reptilian skin. Each carried a contos, a two-handed lance measuring nearly 10 feet in length, designed to shatter infantry lines through sheer momentum. What startled Roman observers was not merely the weight of the charge. Among the armored riders were women, indistinguishable in equipment and posture from their male counterparts. The Sarmatians, an Iranian-speaking confederation that succeeded the Scythians across much of the Eurasian steppe, developed one of the most formidable heavy cavalry systems of the ancient world. Unlike the more fluid Scythian mounted archers, Sarmatian forces emphasized shock impact. Cavalry units trained to maintain formation at high speed, lowering their lances simultaneously to strike as a unified wall of force. Such tactics required rigorous coordination, strength, and sustained discipline. Archaeological evidence from burial mounds across southern Russia and western Kazakhstan has uncovered female skeletons interred with full cavalry equipment. Scale armor fragments recovered from these graves weigh between 20 and 30 pounds. The Kantos lance, when combined with the weight of armor and saddle gear, required precise balance and control. Skeletal remains reveal pronounced hip joint stress consistent with years of mounted riding. Defensive fractures in forearms and embedded projectile points indicate close-quarters combat rather than symbolic affiliation. Roman writers, including Ammianus Marcellinus, made reference to Sarmatian women fighting alongside men. Though often framed as cultural oddities, these remarks align with the burial record. In certain Sarmatian cemeteries, as many as 20% of warrior graves belong to women. The consistency across sites suggests participation embedded within the cavalry structure, not isolated anomalies. Unlike decentralized tribal skirmishes, Sarmatian cavalry operated in regimental units with hierarchical command. Weapon uniformity and standardized armor construction imply organized workshops and supply distribution. If women appear within these regiments, they were incorporated into the operational chain of command. Shock cavalry could not afford untrained riders. Every individual in formation had to execute synchronized maneuvers at speeds exceeding 25 miles per hour. When Rome recruited Sarmatian cavalry auxiliaries into its own military after conflicts along the frontier, it adopted elements of their tactics. Some of these units were stationed as far west as Britannia, yet Roman military documentation makes no sustained acknowledgement of female integration. Whether this reflects selective reporting or genuine demographic shifts remains debated. What is clear is that the original Sarmatian structure normalized women within mounted regiments. The Sarmatian system marks an escalation from integrated warrior society to specialized heavy cavalry formation. This was not merely communal defense, it was battlefield engineering. Riders were components within a coordinated mechanism designed to break enemy lines through concentrated kinetic force. If women could operate effectively within such regiments, controlling heavily armored horses while wielding long lances and synchronized assault, then the boundaries of ancient military specialization expand. If Rome absorbed the tactics but filtered the social composition, what part of that cavalry legacy was intentionally left unrecorded? Kush archery network. In 24 BCE, Roman forces advancing south from Egypt expected swift compliance from the kingdom of Kush. Instead, as they moved along the Nile corridor near the Second Cataract, their forward scouts reported sustained projectile fire from elevated sandstone ridges. Arrows rained down with disciplined timing, striking shields and armor before Roman formations could stabilize. What Roman commanders encountered was not a loose tribal skirmish. It was a coordinated defensive network built around long-range archery. And within that system, evidence suggests women were not peripheral observers, but embedded participants. Kush had long been known as the land of the bow. Egyptian inscriptions dating back centuries praised Nubian archers for exceptional accuracy and draw strength. By the time of Roman expansion, Kushite military infrastructure had evolved into a layered defensive system. Fortified outposts were positioned along strategic river bends. Watch stations were placed on elevated terrain. Communication signals could travel between settlements through drum codes and beacon fires. The Nile itself functioned as both artery and barrier. Excavations at sites such as Meroe and El Kuru have revealed weapon caches containing standardized iron arrowheads, often triangular in shape for armor penetration. In several burial sites associated with military-class individuals, female skeletons have been found interred with full quivers and wrist guards designed to protect the forearm from bowstring recoil. Skeletal analysis shows muscular development in the shoulder, consistent with repeated high-draw weight use. Some remains exhibit healed projectile injuries, indicating exposure to combat conditions rather than symbolic affiliation. Mainstream interpretation has sometimes framed these women as members of elite households granted ceremonial weapons. Yet the distribution pattern complicates that narrative. Female burials with archery equipment appear across multiple sites and across generations. The bows recovered from Kushite contexts are estimated to require draw weights between 70 and 90 pounds. Sustained use of such weapons demands training from adolescence. The defensive architecture of Kush relied on coordinated fire rather than brute force confrontation. Roman legions, trained for formation discipline and close quarters engagement, struggled against long-range harassment in desert terrain where water access was limited. Archers positioned on higher ground could strike at advancing columns before retreating into fortified enclosures. If women were integrated into these archery units, their participation directly influenced the state's military resilience. This network was not an ad hoc arrangement. Production centers for arrowheads suggest organized manufacturing. Storage facilities near fortress sites indicate stockpiling. The Kandake leadership oversaw mobilization, but the operational effectiveness depended on distributed trained personnel capable of responding rapidly to incursions. When Rome ultimately negotiated a treaty rather than fully annexing Kush, it acknowledged a defensive capacity that made occupation costly. The archery network functioned as a force multiplier, compensating for differences in manpower and equipment. The Kushite case represents a refinement of structure. Here, female integration appears not in isolated regiments or symbolic guards, but within a national defense architecture optimized for terrain and endurance. The bow was not merely a weapon, it was the backbone of territorial control. If a state built its security around coordinated archery and trained both men and women to operate within that system, then the definition of a standing army expands beyond infantry formations alone. If Rome calculated that full conquest was strategically inefficient, what does that reveal about the system it faced along the Nile? Onna-musha Corps. In 1580, during the Battle of Senbon Matsubaru in Japan's Sengoku period, the battlefield was littered with the fallen after a brutal clash between rival clans. Centuries later, archaeologists examining skeletal remains from that site conducted DNA analysis, expecting to confirm a conventional samurai conflict dominated by male warriors. The results disrupted that expectation. A measurable percentage of the remains belonged to women. These were not camp followers. Many exhibited blade wounds consistent with direct combat. The implication was difficult to dismiss. Women were embedded within organized defensive forces. The Onna-musha were not mythical figures drawn solely from epic poetry. They were women of the samurai class trained in martial discipline, particularly in the use of the naginata, a pole arm measuring approximately 6 feet in length with a curved blade capable of controlling distance against armored opponents. In feudal Japan's decentralized power structure, regional lords relied on fortified estates and castle complexes that often faced sudden siege. When male retainers marched to external campaigns, internal defense required continuity. Historical records from clan archives indicate that women of samurai households received weapons training from adolescence. This training was not ornamental. It followed structured instruction in stance, timing, and coordinated defense within narrow corridors and gatehouses. The architecture of Japanese castles, with their layered gates and angled approaches, favored disciplined polearm units capable of repelling attackers in confined spaces. Female defenders were trained specifically for this environment. Weapon analysis reinforces this structure. Surviving naginata blades associated with female burials show repeated sharpening and edge wear. Armor fragments tailored for smaller frames demonstrate custom production rather than improvised equipment. The presence of standardized gear suggests institutional recognition of female combat roles within certain domains. Mainstream interpretation has often isolated figures such as Tomo Gozen as exceptional anomalies. However, domain records from the late medieval period indicate that, in times of siege, women were organized into defensive units with designated command roles. The defensive corps did not function as a roaming field army like Dahomey's regiments, but it operated within a clearly defined military system. Its mission was territorial integrity. The Sengoku era, marked by nearly constant civil war between the 15th and early 17th centuries, forced adaptation. Castles were not symbolic residences. They were military nodes. A siege could last weeks. Maintaining defense required every trained individual capable of holding formation on walls and inner gates. The Onna-musha Defensive Corps represented an extension of samurai obligation rather than a departure from it. After Japan's unification under the Tokugawa shogunate in the early 1600s, large-scale warfare diminished. Samurai identity transitioned from active military class to bureaucratic elite. As conflict declined, the visible role of armed women receded. Later, cultural memory emphasized male lineage and stylized swordsmanship, while structured female defense units faded into obscurity. Yet battlefield graves remain. DNA, results remain. Blade wear patterns remain. These physical traces point to a system in which women were not merely emergency substitutes, but trained participants integrated into defensive doctrine. If castle architecture was designed around layered resistance, and if women were trained to occupy those defensive tiers, then the military structure of feudal Japan was more inclusive in practice than later narratives suggest. If history preserved the sword, but neglected the defenders who stood behind the gates, what else within the samurai system has been selectively simplified? Nongo female army. In 1626, along the western coast of Central Africa, Portuguese colonial forces advanced inland toward the kingdom of Nongo, expecting fragmented resistance. Instead, they encountered structured opposition, organized under Queen Nzinga Mbande. European correspondence from the period describes not only her political maneuvering, but the presence of disciplined female units within her armed forces. These were not ceremonial escorts. They were armed formations integrated into campaigns against Portuguese expansion. The Kingdom of Ndongo, located in present-day Angola, operated within a volatile geopolitical environment shaped by Atlantic trade routes and European military intervention. Nzinga inherited a fractured state under sustained pressure from Portuguese slaving expeditions and fortified coastal settlements. To consolidate power, she reorganized military structures, blending traditional Mbundu warrior bands with more centralized command. Within this restructuring, accounts repeatedly reference female fighters serving in protective and offensive capacities. Portuguese missionaries and officers documented female bodyguards trained in spear combat and firearms use. Some reports describe Nzinga maintaining an all-female personal guard stationed within fortified encampments. Unlike symbolic palace attendants, these units participated in defensive operations and strategic retreats into the interior. They were embedded within shifting military camps that functioned as mobile headquarters during prolonged resistance. Weapon evidence recovered from Nongo conflict zones includes iron spearheads and early firearm fragments. The introduction of muskets into regional warfare required structured training. Handling flintlock firearms weighing close to 10 pounds demanded coordination and familiarity with reloading sequences. If female units were trained in these procedures, their inclusion reflects systematic preparation rather than sporadic mobilization. Mainstream colonial narratives often portrayed Nzinga as an exceptional and controversial ruler, focusing on her diplomatic maneuvers and alleged eccentricities. However, stripped of embellishment, the operational facts remain. She sustained resistance against Portuguese forces for decades, shifting alliances between rival African states and European powers. Such longevity required disciplined military organization. Female units within her forces were not incidental. They were components of a broader defensive architecture. The Ndongo case differs from Dahomey's highly institutionalized barracks system. Here, the corps functioned within a mobile war structure designed to evade and counter European fortifications. Camps were relocated strategically. Supply lines were adapted to terrain. Female soldiers embedded in these formations would have been trained for endurance, rapid movement, and coordinated engagement. Portuguese documents frequently express frustration at the resilience of Nzinga's forces. Despite technological advantages, colonial troops faced guerrilla tactics that neutralized open field superiority. Female guards are mentioned in the context of protecting command centers and participating in engagements near river crossings and forested zones. Over time, as Portuguese control consolidated along coastal strongholds, Ndongo's autonomy eroded. Later, historiography often reduced female participation to anecdote. Yet, repeated references across independent colonial records suggest structured presence rather than singular spectacle. If a centralized African kingdom, under sustained European pressure, maintained trained female military units within its command framework, then the model of organized female armed corps extended beyond isolated regions. If European officers documented their presence reluctantly, what does that suggest about the challenge these units pose to assumptions carried across the Atlantic? Whydah royal guards? In the early 18th century, European traders arriving along the Gulf of Guinea described the Kingdom of Whydah as both commercially powerful and militarily disciplined. Ships anchored offshore recorded structured military parades on land, including units of armed women assigned to royal security and defensive operations. These reports, written in shipping logs and merchant correspondence, were not intended for myth-making. They were practical observations from individuals negotiating trade under constant risk. The Kingdom of Whydah, situated along the coast of present-day Benin, functioned as a strategic node in regional commerce before its eventual conquest by Dahomey in 1727. Prior to that collapse, Whydah maintained organized armed forces designed to protect trade routes and urban centers. Within this structure, several European accounts mention female guard contingents attached to the royal compound and deployed during heightened security alerts. Unlike the later fully institutionalized Dahomey Corps, the Whydah female units appear to have functioned primarily as palace guards with conditional deployment capability. However, guard status in West African monarchies did not imply ceremonial passivity. Royal compounds were military hubs. Guard units were trained to respond to coup attempts, internal rebellion, and external raids. To maintain such readiness, structured training was essential. Merchant diaries from British and Dutch traders describe women stationed at palace gates carrying spears and occasionally muskets. Their uniforms were reportedly standardized, with coordinated attire distinguishing them from civilian populations. The presence of firearms indicates access to weapon training and logistical integration into the broader military supply chain. Mainstream interpretation often dismisses these references as exaggerated colonial curiosity. Yet, when multiple independent trading sources across decades describe similar configurations, consistency emerges. Whydah was not a loosely organized tribal entity. It maintained a court bureaucracy, taxation systems, and military patrols protecting inland caravan routes. Embedding women within guard units implies deliberate organizational policy, rather than isolated anomaly. The fall of Whydah to Dahomey reshaped the regional power balance. Following conquest, Dahomey absorbed aspects of Whydah's military and administrative structures. It is plausible that regional precedents for female guard integration influenced Dahomey's later expansion of its own corps. If Whydah maintained structured female guard units prior to its collapse, then the phenomenon in West Africa may represent a broader pattern rather than a singular invention. The Whydah case illustrates an intermediate stage between palace guard and field regiment. Guard units functioned as immediate defense layers within centralized authority. In times of conflict, such units could be redeployed as combat reinforcements. The presence of firearms suggests operational readiness beyond symbolic display. When European traders documented these formations, they did so while negotiating alliances and assessing threat levels. Their reports focus on practical details such as weaponry, discipline, and proximity to royal command centers. This tone reduces the likelihood of purely fantastical embellishment. After Whydah's conquest and eventual integration into Dahomey's expanding structure, its independent identity faded from European maps. References to its female guards diminished as Dahomey's larger corps dominated colonial attention. If multiple West African kingdoms embedded female guard systems within their military frameworks, then the Dahomey Corps did not arise in isolation. It evolved within a regional context that normalized structured female participation in armed security. If trade empires quietly observed these systems while prioritizing commerce over commentary, what aspects of African military organization were simplified when colonial narratives later took control of the story? Caucasian female guard traditions. In the 12th century, during the reign of Queen Tamar of Georgia, foreign envoys arriving at the royal court recorded something unexpected. Among the armored retainers positioned within the palace complex were women assigned to guard duty. These were not ceremonial attendants dressed for spectacle. They stood armed, disciplined, and strategically placed at key access points within fortified compounds. Their presence was not hidden. It was institutional. The Caucasus region, spanning modern Armenia and Georgia, has long functioned as a geopolitical crossroads between Byzantine, Persian, and later Mongol expansion. In such a volatile environment, survival required fortified cities, rapid mobilization systems, and reliable internal security. Court chronicles and external diplomatic correspondence from the High Middle Ages suggest that certain royal courts maintained female guard contingents integrated into palace defense structures. Unlike tribal formations or mass field armies, these units functioned as elite security corps. Palace defense was a critical strategic layer. Assassination attempts, coups, and shifting noble alliances posed constant threats. Embedding trained female guards within inner chambers provided a security buffer that limited infiltration by male conspirators. This was not symbolic chivalry, it was tactical architecture. Medieval Armenian sources describe women of noble lineage trained in mounted combat and archery, particularly in frontier regions exposed to raids. While not all such women formed permanent regiments, certain court environments institutionalized female guard roles within defined command hierarchies. Weapon inventories from Armenian and Georgian fortresses include armor sets tailored to smaller frames, suggesting deliberate provisioning rather than improvisation. Queen Tamar's reign from 1184 to 1213 marked a period of territorial expansion and relative political stability in Georgia. Chroniclers portray her authority as both spiritual and martial. Diplomatic letters from Crusader states acknowledged Georgian military capacity during this period. The structured palace guard system likely reflected broader military organization supporting centralized monarchy. Mainstream historiography often focuses on Tamar's political leadership, while minimizing the operational framework that protected it. Yet royal security structures in medieval states were inseparable from broader military doctrine. Guard units trained for combat readiness, particularly in fortified hilltop cities, where narrow passages favored disciplined close-quarters defense. Archaeological remains of Caucasian fortifications reveal layered gate systems and elevated watchtowers requiring coordinated defense. If female guards were stationed within inner defense rings, they were part of a tiered security design. Such placement indicates institutional trust and formalized training. Unlike the large-scale regiments of Dahomey or the integrated cavalry of the Sarmatians, the Caucasian model represents elite specialization. Here, female military roles were concentrated in high-security environments tied directly to sovereign authority. Their purpose was not mass battlefield dominance, but preservation of command continuity. As regional powers shifted under Mongol incursions and later Ottoman and Persian influence, many medieval court structures were dismantled or absorbed into new regimes. Written records fragmented. References to female guard traditions became scattered within chronicles rather than consolidated in military treatises. If medieval Caucasian states institutionalized female security corps within fortified capitals, then structured female military participation extended into Christian monarchies as well as African kingdoms and steppe confederations. If their role was embedded within palace architecture and sovereign protection, what other defensive layers in medieval states included women whose presence later chroniclers chose not to emphasize? The Trung Sisters army. In 40 CE, along the marshlands and river corridors of the Red River Delta, a military force began to assemble with a structure that imperial officials of the Han dynasty had not anticipated. At its center stood two sisters, Trung Trac and Trung Nhi. According to both Vietnamese chronicles and later Chinese accounts, they did not merely incite revolt. They mounted war elephants and rode at the head of organized formations, turning symbolic leadership into visible command presence on the battlefield. War elephants were not decorative animals, they were strategic assets. Standing up to 9 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing several tons, these animals functioned as ancient shock platforms. Elevated above infantry lines, commanders riding elephants could survey troop movements and signal maneuvers across open terrain. The psychological impact alone was significant. Infantry formations unaccustomed to facing armored animals often broke under the combined force of trampling weight and downward spear thrusts from riders positioned high above. Sources describe the Trung sisters leading charges while mounted, accompanied by female generals who commanded regional units. This detail matters. Mounted command suggests pre-existing cavalry and elephant handling infrastructure. Training elephants for warfare required years of conditioning, coordinated handlers, and logistical supply of food and water. Maintaining even a small elephant corps implied organized state-level preparation rather than spontaneous uprising. The rebellion rapidly captured more than 60 citadels across northern Vietnam. Such expansion required territorial command hierarchy. Each stronghold likely had assigned officers responsible for recruitment, fortification, repair, and resource management. The sisters established a capital at Mei Lin, formalizing centralized governance. That transition from rebellion to sovereignty indicates operational continuity. Military formations in the Delta region would have adapted to marshland terrain. Infantry units armed with spears and bows could maneuver through riverbanks, while elephant corps broke defensive lines at critical choke points. Control of waterways enabled rapid redeployment of troops by boat, reinforcing threatened positions. The integration of elephants within this environment suggests coordinated battlefield doctrine rather than isolated spectacle. Chinese imperial records revealed that the Han court treated the uprising as a substantial threat. General Ma Yuan was dispatched with reinforced troops, including cavalry and naval elements. Campaign descriptions indicate difficult engagements in humid terrain, where mobility was restricted. War elephants posed particular challenges to cavalry units unfamiliar with countering large animal charges. Ultimately, by 43 CE, sustained imperial pressure overwhelmed the resistance. The sisters reportedly chose death rather than surrender, ending their centralized command. After reasserting control, Han authorities tightened administrative oversight and dismantled local leadership networks that had enabled organized mobilization. The image of two women riding elephants into battle is often remembered as legend, yet behind that image lies military logic, elevated command visibility, shock assault capacity, coordinated infantry support, territorial governance across dozens of strongholds. If the Trung Sisters commanded elephant units and regional generals in sustained conflict against the Han Empire, then their army functioned not as symbolic rebellion, but as an organized war structure capable of confronting imperial power. If mounted elephants carried sovereign authority into battle, what does that reveal about how this army saw itself, and how seriously its empire-sized opponent was forced to respond? Dahomey at full strength. In 1890, as tensions between the Kingdom of Dahomey and French colonial forces escalated, European intelligence reports described an unsettling development. The Dahomey military was not merely preparing for skirmish, it was mobilizing at full capacity. Entire regiments assembled outside of Dahomey. Drills intensified. Supply depots were stocked with ammunition and provisions. And within those ranks stood thousands of uniformed women, organized into structured divisions that mirrored and, in some sectors, rivaled the male forces. At peak strength, the Dahomey army was not a loose coalition of tribal fighters. It functioned as a centralized military machine under royal command. The female corps was not peripheral to this structure. It formed a parallel operational branch with defined roles. Units specialized in marksmanship, others in blade combat, others in reconnaissance. European observers noted that these divisions moved with synchronized timing during parades and combat simulations. The discipline was mechanical. Training regimens intensified during mobilization periods. Recruits were subjected to endurance marches under tropical heat, often exceeding 20 miles in a single day. Obstacle courses tested agility and pain tolerance. Musket drills required precision under time pressure, with volleys fired in coordinated sequence. Officers enforced strict codes of conduct. Desertion or disobedience resulted in severe penalties, reinforcing chain of command integrity. Weapon inventories from captured Dahomey positions reveal standardized issue patterns. Flintlock muskets of consistent caliber were distributed across units. Bladed weapons showed uniform design, optimized for close quarters engagement. Ammunition stockpiles were stored in secured compounds guarded by rotating watch units, including female contingents. This was not symbolic mobilization, it was logistical planning at scale. French commanders initially underestimated the strategic coherence of Dahomey's mobilization. Early encounters during the 1890 campaign exposed their miscalculation. Assault waves composed primarily of female soldiers advanced despite artillery fire, maintaining formation discipline even as casualties mounted. Officers documented the psychological impact of facing adversaries who did not break under sustained bombardment. Mainstream colonial narratives later emphasized technological superiority as the decisive factor in Dahomey's defeat. While repeating rifles and artillery undeniably tipped the balance, battlefield reports confirmed that the female regiments operated as cohesive military entities. They executed flanking maneuvers, defended strategic choke points, and covered retreats when male units faltered. When Dahomey ultimately fell in 1894, the dissolution of the female corps was immediate and systematic. French authorities disbanded units, confiscated weapons, and integrated survivors into civilian structures. Colonial governance reframed the corps as a relic of an obsolete regime, emphasizing exotic spectacle over structural sophistication. Yet the mobilization records tell a different story. At full capacity, Dahomey maintained a professional female army integrated into national defense strategy, capable of sustained campaign operations. It recruited, trained, supplied, and deployed thousands under centralized command. This final escalation reveals a pattern that began centuries earlier across distant regions: integrated warrior societies, cavalry regiments, defensive corps, royal guard structures, and finally, a fully mobilized national army with a female branch operating at scale against a modern empire. If such a system could exist openly until dismantled by colonial conquest, then organized female armies were not theoretical anomalies. They were historical realities sustained through structure, discipline, and state power. If empire erased the institutions it conquered and simplified the memory of those who resisted, what other military systems have been reduced to footnotes simply because they contradicted expectations? Conclusion. Across continents and across centuries, a consistent pattern has emerged. These were not isolated heroines elevated by legend. They were not emergency fighters called upon in moments of desperation. In each case, we examined structured military systems where women were embedded within organized chains of command. They trained under discipline. They operated within defined hierarchies. They were provisioned, armed, and deployed with strategic intent. In Dahomey, the female corps maintained barracks, rank divisions, and logistical supply chains strong enough to confront a European colonial army. In Kush, sovereign leadership intersected with military authority, negotiating directly with Rome after structured resistance. Among the Scythians and Sarmatians, burial evidence reveals integration within cavalry regiments and mobile war societies. In Japan, defensive corps operated within castle architecture designed for layered resistance. In Nongo and Whydah, female units formed part of centralized command systems confronting colonial expansion. In the Caucasus, elite palace guards preserved sovereign authority inside fortified capitals. The geographic spread is significant: West Africa, Northeast Africa, Eurasian steppe, East Asia, Central Africa, the Caucasus. These systems did not emerge from a single cultural anomaly. They developed independently under different political, religious, and economic conditions. What unites them is structure, organization, continuity. Mainstream military history often frames female participation as exceptional or symbolic, yet exceptions do not repeat across civilizations separated by thousands of miles. When burial records, colonial correspondence, architectural design, and battlefield reports align, a different picture emerges. In multiple societies, women were integrated into institutional military frameworks when survival demanded total mobilization. Another pattern also repeats. In many cases, these systems declined or disappeared, following imperial consolidation or political centralization. As external powers absorbed territories, they dismantled indigenous military institutions. Later, historiography, often written by the victorious, simplified or minimized structures that challenged conventional hierarchies. If organized female armies operated as normalized components of state defense in multiple eras, then the question shifts. It is no longer whether women fought. The evidence confirms that they did. The deeper question is how historical memory selects which systems to preserve and which to reduce to myth. If empire tends to standardize narrative along with territory, what other institutional realities have been compressed into anecdote because they did not align with dominant expectations? And if we re-examine military history not as a single linear tradition, but as a mosaic of adaptive systems, how different might our understanding of warfare become?